August 23, 1941. General Heinz Guderian stood before the most critical decision of Operation Barbarossa, with Moscow just 200 miles away and the Soviet Union's capital defenseless before his panzer spearhead. Army Group Center had shattered Soviet resistance across the entire front, captured over 1 million prisoners, and opened the road to Stalin's seat of power. What Guderian chose instead would extend World War II by 3 years and cost Germany its only chance for decisive victory in the East. Rather than driving straight toward Moscow to decapitate the Soviet government, he would turn his tanks south toward Ukraine's wheat fields and oil resources, abandoning strategic opportunity for economic objectives that meant nothing if the war continued. Hitler had ordered the diversion against the unanimous opposition of his generals, but Guderian's compliance with strategic insanity would prove that even Germany's most brilliant tank commander could be corrupted by Nazi ideology that prioritized economics over strategy. The decision to ignore Moscow would give Stalin the time he needed to organize Soviet defense, allow the Red Army to rebuild after catastrophic defeats, and ensure that German forces would face a prolonged war of attrition that Nazi Germany could never win. This is the story of how Guderian chose the wrong direction and lost Germany the war in the East, how economic obsession corrupted strategic judgment, and how the general who pioneered Blitzkrieg forgot that speed and concentration were meaningless without decisive objectives. The fatal decision began 6 weeks earlier, when Guderian's tactical brilliance created the strategic opportunity that Hitler's economic fixations would destroy. July 10, 1941. Operation Barbarossa achieved complete tactical surprise as German armored spearheads penetrated hundreds of miles into Soviet territory within the first week of invasion. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group led Army Group Center's advance, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of concentrated armor against dispersed Soviet defenses. The strategic situation exceeded German expectations in every measurable way. Soviet forces were retreating in disorder, millions of Red Army soldiers were being captured in massive encirclements, and Stalin's government appeared to be losing control of both military operations and civilian administration. Guderian's panzer groups were advancing faster than German planning had predicted, creating opportunities for decisive strategic success that original German strategy had not anticipated. The rapid collapse of Soviet border defenses opened possibilities for ending the war in 1941 through capture of key political and industrial centers. Most critically, Soviet resistance was so disorganized that German forces could choose their objectives based on strategic value rather than tactical necessity. The Red Army could not prevent German advances in any direction, giving Wehrmacht commanders unprecedented freedom to pursue war-winning targets. But Hitler's strategic vision was corrupted by economic theories that prioritized resource capture over political victory. Instead of exploiting tactical success to achieve strategic decision, German planning began focusing on territorial conquest that would provide economic benefits regardless of whether the war continued. July 19, 1941. Directive 33 revealed Hitler's fundamental misunderstanding of strategic priorities in modern warfare. Instead of concentrating German strength against decisive objectives, the Führer ordered Army Group Center to split its forces between Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine, pursuing multiple goals simultaneously. The directive violated basic principles of strategy that Guderian had spent his career developing. Concentration of force against decisive objectives was essential for achieving breakthrough operations. Dispersing German strength across multiple fronts would eliminate the advantages that rapid German advances had created. Guderian's immediate response to Directive 33 demonstrated his understanding that Hitler's strategic vision was fundamentally flawed. "We must concentrate our forces against Moscow," he argued. "The Soviet capital is the political, industrial, and transportation center of the USSR. Its capture will end Soviet resistance." But Hitler's economic obsessions overruled military logic. Ukraine's agricultural resources and Caucasian oil were more important to Nazi planning than Soviet political collapse. Economic conquest would continue even if it prevented military victory. The conflict between tactical success and strategic confusion would define the remainder of Operation Barbarossa. German forces were winning every battle while losing the strategic initiative that could have won the war. August 4th, 1941. The Smolensk encirclement demonstrated that German tactical superiority could achieve decisive strategic results if properly concentrated and directed. Guderian's armor trapped over 300,000 Soviet soldiers and eliminated organized resistance between German spearheads and the Soviet capital. Moscow lay open before German advance with minimal Soviet forces available for effective defense. Soviet government preparations for evacuation indicated that Stalin's regime recognized the impossibility of defending the capital against concentrated German assault. Intelligence reports confirmed that Soviet military leadership was in complete disarray following the Smolensk disaster. The Red Army had lost its most experienced commanders and its most effective units. Soviet industrial production was being disrupted by the approach of German forces and the evacuation of critical facilities. Guderian's assessment of the strategic situation was unequivocal. Moscow can be taken within 2 weeks if we maintain concentration and momentum. The Soviet government will collapse if we capture their capital before they can organize effective resistance. The opportunity was unprecedented in modern warfare, a capital city of a major power lying defenseless before concentrated armored assault. Political, military, and economic objectives could be achieved simultaneously through a single, decisive operation. August 12, 1941. Soviet defensive preparations around Moscow revealed that Stalin understood the strategic significance of his capital better than Hitler understood the strategic requirements for victory. Red Army forces were being concentrated for the defense of Moscow rather than dispersed across multiple fronts. The Soviet response to German strategy demonstrated superior strategic thinking despite inferior tactical capabilities. Stalin was prioritizing political survival over territorial defense, concentrating available forces to defend objectives that mattered for continued resistance. German intelligence noted that Soviet industrial evacuation was accelerating as Moscow appeared increasingly threatened. Critical war production facilities were being moved beyond German reach, reducing the economic benefits that Nazi planning expected to achieve through territorial conquest. Most significantly, Soviet recruitment and training programs were producing replacement forces faster than German advances could eliminate existing Soviet units. The Red Army was growing stronger through consolidation, while the Wehrmacht was growing weaker through dispersion. Guderian's warnings about lost strategic momentum were becoming prophetic. Every day we delay the assault on Moscow gives the Soviets more time to organize resistance. We are allowing them to recover from defeats that should have ended their ability to continue fighting. August 18, 1941. Hitler's supplement to Directive 33 ordered the definitive abandonment of the Moscow offensive in favor of economic objectives that served Nazi ideology rather than military necessity. Army Group Center's panzer forces would be divided between Leningrad and Ukraine, eliminating concentrated strength that could have achieved decisive results. The supplement revealed how completely Hitler's strategic thinking had been corrupted by economic theories that ignored military realities. Capturing agricultural and industrial resources was more important than defeating Soviet military forces or eliminating Soviet political leadership. Guderian's final protest against the strategic redirection demonstrated his understanding that Hitler was sacrificing certain victory for uncertain economic gains. Moscow is the key to Soviet resistance. Capturing wheat fields in Ukraine will not end the war if the Soviet government continues to organize opposition from Moscow. But Nazi economic planning had become more important than Wehrmacht strategic analysis. Hitler believed that controlling Soviet resources would guarantee German victory regardless of whether Soviet political and military leadership survived to continue resistance. The decision to abandon Moscow represented the triumph of ideological obsession over strategic competence. Economic theories had replaced military logic as the foundation of German strategic planning. August 23, 1941. Guderian received final orders to turn his 2nd Panzer Group south toward Kiev rather than continue the advance toward Moscow. The decision represented complete strategic failure by German High Command, abandoning decisive objectives for economic targets that could not end Soviet resistance. Guderian's compliance with obviously flawed orders revealed how Nazi command structure corrupted even the most competent German officers. Professional military judgment was subordinated to political ideology regardless of strategic consequences. The turn south began immediately, despite the protests of every German field commander involved in the decision. Tactical competence was being sacrificed to strategic incompetence through command decisions that prioritized Nazi economic theory over Wehrmacht operational effectiveness. Soviet intelligence immediately recognized the significance of German strategic redirection. Moscow was no longer under immediate threat, allowing Soviet forces to be redistributed for prolonged resistance rather than concentrated for desperate defense of the capital. The strategic opportunity that German tactical success had created was being deliberately destroyed by German strategic leadership. Military victory was being sacrificed for economic conquest that would prove meaningless if the war continued indefinitely. September 26, 1941. The Kiev encirclement achieved spectacular tactical results that confirmed the futility of Hitler's strategic priorities. German forces captured over 650,000 Soviet prisoners and eliminated organized resistance across Ukraine, but the victories contributed nothing to ending Soviet ability to continue fighting. Soviet response to the Ukrainian disasters demonstrated that territorial losses did not equal strategic defeat when political and military leadership remained intact. The Red Army continued to produce new forces faster than German operations could destroy existing ones. Meanwhile, Moscow's defenses were being systematically strengthened while German attention focused on economic objectives. Soviet engineering troops were constructing defensive positions that would make future German assault far more costly than immediate attack would have been. The contrast between tactical success and strategic failure was becoming impossible to ignore. German forces were winning every battle while losing the strategic initiative that could have achieved decisive victory. Guderian's assessment of the Ukrainian campaign results was devastatingly accurate. We have captured territory and prisoners, but we have not advanced toward ending the war. Moscow remains in Soviet hands, and Soviet resistance continues to grow stronger. October 2, 1941. Operation Typhoon finally began the assault on Moscow after 6 crucial weeks had been wasted pursuing economic objectives in Ukraine. German forces now faced organized Soviet defenses rather than the chaotic resistance that had characterized earlier Soviet responses. The delay caused by Hitler's strategic misdirection had fundamentally altered the character of warfare on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces were now fighting from prepared positions with adequate supplies and competent leadership rather than retreating in disorder from overwhelming German pressure. Weather conditions were deteriorating as autumn rains turned Russian roads into impassable mud, slowing German advances that had previously achieved breakthrough results through speed and momentum. The tactical advantages that German armor had exploited were being eliminated by seasonal conditions. Most critically, Soviet industrial evacuation was complete, moving war production beyond German reach regardless of territorial conquest. The economic objectives that had motivated Hitler's strategic decisions were no longer achievable even through successful military operations. Guderian's forces were now advancing toward Moscow under conditions that made decisive victory impossible. The strategic opportunity that had existed in August had been destroyed by German strategic incompetence during September. December 6, 1941. The Soviet winter counteroffensive began with attacks that drove German forces back from Moscow's outskirts, demonstrating that the strategic initiative had passed to the Red Army. Soviet forces that had been barely functional in July were now conducting effective offensive operations against Wehrmacht units. The counteroffensive confirmed that Hitler's decision to abandon the Moscow assault in August had cost Germany its only chance for decisive victory in the East. Soviet political and military leadership had used the respite to organize resistance that German forces could no longer overcome. German responses to Soviet attacks revealed how completely the strategic situation had been reversed. Wehrmacht forces that had advanced hundreds of miles in weeks were now struggling to maintain defensive positions just miles from their objectives. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was forced to retreat from positions that could have been Moscow's suburbs if German strategy had maintained concentration and momentum. The tactical competence that had created strategic opportunity was now being used to salvage strategic disaster. The winter crisis demonstrated that Hitler's economic obsessions had transformed certain German victory into prolonged German struggle. Strategic incompetence had made tactical success meaningless. 1942-1945. The long-term consequences of ignoring Moscow shaped the entire remainder of World War II. Soviet political leadership survived to organize resistance that would eventually drive German forces back to Berlin. The war that could have ended in 1941 continued until 1945. Soviet industrial production, evacuated during the German delay, would eventually exceed German production and provide the material foundation for Soviet victory. The economic resources that Hitler had prioritized proved less valuable than the political victory he had abandoned. The Red Army that barely existed in August 1941 would eventually become the largest and most effective military force in European history. Soviet resistance continued because German strategy had failed to eliminate Soviet political and military leadership when elimination was possible. Guderian's later writings acknowledged that the decision to ignore Moscow had been strategically catastrophic. The capture of Moscow in August 1941 would have ended Soviet resistance. Our turn south gave Stalin the time he needed to organize the defense that eventually defeated us. Post-war analysis confirmed that Soviet defenses in August 1941 could not have prevented concentrated German assault on Moscow. Stalin's government was preparing for evacuation, Soviet military leadership was disorganized, and Red Army forces were insufficient for effective capital defense. The Battle of Moscow became the turning point of the Eastern Front, not because Soviet forces were strong enough to defend their capital, but because German strategy gave them time to become strong enough. Hitler's economic priorities had made Soviet military recovery possible. German failure in the East demonstrated that ideological obsession could corrupt strategic judgment so completely that tactical brilliance became strategically irrelevant. The Wehrmacht's tactical competence could not overcome strategic incompetence that abandoned decisive objectives for economic theories. Guderian's compliance with strategic insanity revealed how Nazi command structure corrupted even the most professionally competent German officers. Military logic was subordinated to political ideology regardless of strategic consequences. The general who pioneered blitzkrieg had forgotten that speed and concentration were meaningless without decisive objectives. His tactical innovations became strategically worthless when applied to objectives that could not end enemy resistance. In the end, Guderian chose the wrong direction because Nazi ideology prioritized economic conquest over political victory. The decision to pursue Ukrainian resources rather than Soviet political collapse had guaranteed that the war would continue until German defeat became inevitable. The strategic opportunity that existed in August 1941 would never return. German tactical superiority could create breakthrough opportunities, but those opportunities were meaningless if strategic leadership lacked the competence to exploit them decisively. Moscow remained in Soviet hands because German strategy had prioritized territorial conquest over political victory. The capital that could have been captured in weeks became the center of resistance that would eventually drive German forces back across Europe. Guderian's greatest tactical success had become his greatest strategic failure because it was applied to objectives that served Nazi economic theory rather than military necessity. The wrong direction had been chosen for ideologically correct reasons that proved strategically disastrous. The lesson was clear but ignored. In modern warfare, political objectives were more important than economic ones, and strategic concentration was more valuable than territorial dispersion. Hitler's economic obsessions had made German military competence strategically irrelevant. The general who chose the wrong direction had proven that tactical brilliance without strategic wisdom was worse than tactical incompetence with strategic clarity. Guderian's tanks could go anywhere except toward objectives that would end the war.